It's very rough ground, very thick forested land, 70 square miles in Virginia, known as the wilderness. Often referred to as Satan's country because of the tough terrain. So, General Grant is marching his troops from here through this wilderness area. And his goal is to get into this very wide and wide open meadow and engage the Confederates there. So his General Grant's strategy is marches men through this heavily forested area and engage Confederate troops on this big clearing or meadow on the other side. Does that make sense? You'd want to do that? Get those Confederates to open ground. Well, the problem for Robert E. Lee is he's got less than half as many men as Grant does, as he waits for Grant to meet him in that open clearing. He's only got half as many men. So Jonathan, what bold move does Robert E. Lee make to make up for the fact he has less than half as many men?
Is them in the forest?
He attacks them in the wilderness, feeling that that would give him a terrain advantage where he could hide the fact that he only has half as many men. So Lee makes the bold move to attack the Union troops directly in the wilderness. Because if he gets out in open ground, he's outnumbered more than 2-1. Sitting duck. So Lee initiates an attack upon the Union in the wilderness. And this Battle of the Wilderness lasts 2 full days, and it is the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. It is ranked higher than the savage fighting we talked about at Gettysburg, and there would be no fighting after this that would be as bloody and savage as the fighting in the wilderness. You think fighting in a cornfield was tough? Remember at Antietam? Fighting in this wilderness was unbelievable. And if you weren't killed in the Battle of the Wilderness and you were just wounded, what might be the way you'd lose your life as a wounded soldier in the wilderness? What's that? Okay, no.
Help if you're wounded that way.
Well, that might be, eventually you might be, but if you were wounded, that's a good, if you were wounded in the wilderness, keep in mind that they have infantry fire and cannon fire into there. I mean, both sides are lobbing cannons into the wilderness. How might you die if you were wounded in the wilderness? Say it.
Cannon.
What?
But like cannon.
And what would a cannon maybe do if it didn't hit you? It explode. What might it do to that heavily wooded area?
Splinter.
Started on fire. So many of these wounded soldiers that couldn't get out because their wounds burned to death in the wilderness. Or possibly maybe a tree that's on fire would fall on them as they laid up against a tree trunk wounded. It was a savage situation. Can you imagine being shot and wounded in the stomach, leaned up against a tree, and all of a sudden the fire just gets closer and closer and you can't move and you sit there and burn to death? That would be a horrible death. Many, many soldiers that were wounded on both sides in the wilderness died being burned to death because the whole area was on fire before it was over. Now, when this 2-day battle is over, the Union lost 20,000 men killed or wounded. 20,000 in this 2-day battle in the wilderness. The Union lost 20,000. That's almost as many as they lost at Gettysburg in 3 days, right? Now, the Confederate lost, quote, only 9,500. But what was the significance of that? What's that? Population. From this point on, population is going to make the difference. It isn't going to matter how many men the Union lose. It's going to matter tremendously how many the Confederates lose. So all the Confederates are doing is fighting a defensive battle to protect Richmond. This is the first one. Grant loses 20,000. No big deal. But guess what? We got 9,500 Confederates, which is a really big deal because they're running out of men. Any loss at this point of life for the Confederates is a bad deal. It's leading towards defeat. So although the Union casualties were much higher than that of the South, the Confederates suffered the most, and the Civil War was simply boiling down to a population issue, so that the Confederate Army could really not afford to lose any more soldiers if they were going to have any chance of defending Richmond and maybe winning this war. Okay? All right, tomorrow we'll tell you about the Battle of Spotsylvania and the Battle of Cold Harbor. Then we're going to have a presidential election in the middle of this. And then the Deep South is going to fall to the Union, and pretty soon Petersburg and then Richmond are going to be forced to surrender, and the war is going to be over. So that's kind of where we're at, kiddos.